In 2011, author and researcher Eli Pariser put out a book, and the title of the book talks about how personalization of our internet experience is changing how we think and the information that we receive. Hey everybody, this is Mr. Molina. In this quick video here, we're going to be discussing this idea of personalization, how search engines really do work, but how that is incorporated into our content for chapter 3, which is related to our individual filtering and how we perceive messages and etc. Let's move right into it. Today's learning objectives are to identify and discuss informational processing tasks, and then we'll also be analyzing the idea of exposure to our media messages that we receive on a daily basis. Now, there are a few elements here to discuss in chapter 3, which help us to identify our own individual processes. And these are more cognitive-based processes. So in the first part of our process, we really have a set of lenses here. We are going to filter and make decisions on what to attend to of all of the thousands, if not millions, of bits of information that we receive every day on our phones or on the television, reading a book, etc., or even just driving down the street. We have to have that ability to filter information because it would become so overwhelming. And we do so subconsciously, as we have discussed before. We'll also be looking at meaning matching, which is recognizing any references, any previous things that we've experienced in our lives, and use that to locate any previously learned definitions for each word or image that's maybe displayed on our screens. We'll also be taking a look at some of the meaning construction where we evoke our emotions. We personalize our information we receive, and we try to make some connection to our own lives with regards to this content. And it, yes, evokes our personal frame. So do we have a filtering process in place? Absolutely. We start from the personalized individual cognitive processing that we engage in, but there is also a filtering process obviously taking place every day on our devices, which is also something that we will allude to here when we discuss filtering. So the information processing is really driven by the filtering process and how we are seen, as you have seen this image, as the filter bubble. Essentially, we have built ourselves into our own comfort zones and are exposing ourselves to ideas that comply with our preconceived notions of the world, that align with our ideologies, with our spiritual beliefs, and even our political affiliations. So you might be asking, well, what's the consequences? What are the implications of living in a digital world where most of the information we receive or that we're going to receive has already been filtered through some digital algorithm, which is a tool, a software tool that will allow for you to receive messages in a much more personalized way than somebody else sitting next to you who has clicked on other things or searched for other ideas or information in the past. So selective exposure has been amplified in this digital age. We ourselves will seek and shape media messages to fit our personal narratives, our support, and support our values and our viewpoints. And again, it is a cognitive process that produces meanings corresponding with our cultural beliefs, our values, our interests, and these get compounded every time we do a Google search or click on an article that is basically going to support what we already believe in. So Pariser's argument is that we receive and we process information in a very selective way. This is a funnel, obviously, but the way it works is there's a selectivity principle here that we have to identify. At the very top, you have exposure. So in other words, we have to indeed take that step of exposing ourselves and making the decision to click on that YouTube video that already is relevant to other things we've watched before. And the more likely we are to do that, the more likely we are to actually pay attention, which drives us a little bit further down the funnel and down the pipeline here, which the consequence is we are selectively retaining information, beliefs, values that we're more likely to then share with others. So this is a limited effects sort of paradigm or way of thinking about how the media works to manipulate us in some way, but also it is actively how we consume and process information. So moving on from the filtration aspect of information processing, we look at then the next step, which is meaning making or meaning matching, which is the process of recognizing any elements. These can be familiar ringtones or characters in a movie or actors or actresses or simply just our familiar platforms. In these messages, and we access our memory to find the meanings we have memorized for those specific elements, whether they be auditory or visual. And what we end up doing is we begin to memorize these symbols. And so this takes us into a little bit of what's called semiotics approach, where we decide, hey, well, this is an apple. How did I know that? How do I associate it with the brand Apple? Well, over time, as we have seen and grown with this brand, we can then create some matching that takes place. So we identify the symbol, we match it up with what it means in our heads, and then therefore it leads us to even more examples, such as new ones. We had no idea what this crazy looking ball was before the year 2020 occurred, but now that we have experienced COVID-19, we are now able to match this particular symbol with some meaning and identify what it does mean for us moving forward in our society. So the next step in this information processing has to do with our construction of new meaning. So it requires us to think about moving beyond the standard denotated meaning of a word, or in this case, we're looking at the term COVID-19, and we defined it. We understand that it's agreed upon, but then we create meaning for ourselves, which becomes very subjective. It evokes our frame of reference. It evokes our point of view. And we use these skills of induction, deduction, right? What does it mean? What are the implications? What are some of the patterns that I'm seeing? And we group them and then we synthesize them for ourselves. This is why you have so many recent interpretations of the pandemic and what seriousness it could bring to our country or our world. And so you had various people on different ends of the spectrum trying to politicize masks and lockdowns and so forth. So you started to see a lot of this construction happening in different ways. And also what occurs in meaning construction is when we do this with images that are very thought-provoking and emotionally provoking to us, which news organizations tend to do often, is they'll amplify something that's very controversial, such as these images here that we've seen in the past. So this ideally is very relevant to how we process our information. We want to make sure that we identify the dangers of a one-sided story and identify perhaps the fallacy in how we process these images, right? Because sometimes they could be seen from a certain point of view when in fact we didn't get the entire story or the other side of the picture, as you can see here. So there are several challenges that we face in processing information. So as you notice, we already are filtering ourselves cognitively, but the digital algorithms that are in place online to track our previous search results, our previous behavior, to then give us new personalized information That is what is happening. And it's happening at a much faster rate than it was in 2011 when Eli recognized this in his research. So moving on to the second learning objective, we'll be analyzing the idea of exposure to media messages. So now that we have a clear idea of how we process information, let's look at what actually happens when we expose ourselves and then we therefore put attention to an actual message, because the argument is that there are too many messages even within one digital platform like Instagram or Facebook that we can pay attention to. We oftentimes shoo them away. So there's what's called physical exposure. So I have a newspaper here, if you can see it through my filter, or you could have a book in front of you, or maybe you have a song playing in the background. That physical exposure of being in the same place with that media content is the first initial step. And what ends up happening is we oftentimes take that for granted and call it, oh, yeah, I was exposed to the news today just by going through and seeing some headlines through my Twitter feed. But what the argument is that that is only a very simple way to expose oneself, and it's almost through your subconscious. It's not really being processed at this point. You're just putting yourself in the same physical space as the media message. Now, the next step, and these are all sequential. So in order for me to get to perceptual, I have to have my physical exposure first. The perceptual is, hey, I know that there's a newspaper here, or I see that, there's a magazine laying on the table, or there's a song playing in the restaurant. My perceptual cues will identify that, and I will then, take time to, you know, then hopefully pay some attention to what the lyrics are in that song, which is then the psychological exposure. So again, these are very sequential. I have to be in the same space. I have to identify that the media content is there, it's present. And then the psychological is actually where we begin to decide, hey, maybe I want to read this, or I do want to pay close attention to it. So in order for me to get to actually paying attention, I must pass all these three hurdles of exposure first. So once I then decide, hey, well, I want to pay some attention here, then we got to think about the process involved with exposing ourselves. So once I've decided, hey, I want to pay some attention, these are the four states of exposure that are discussed in chapter 3. So the automatic state is pretty much what it states here. Whereas we decide, hey, well, I want to put attention to this, and it's almost like automatic. I'm in pilot mode still. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to kind of flip through, or I'm going to try to decide what I want to watch on my Netflix. Then the attention state comes into play, where we have that conscious awareness of what we're choosing, and or if we're flipping through the regular broadcast channels, we realize that, hey, well, this show is on NCIS or Dateline, and this is what I want to watch. So in the transported state is really where you're watching your favorite show. It's the next episode. You have transplanted yourself in there, and you lose track of the world surroundings, which is sometimes a good thing. And that's why you decided to watch that film. The self-reflexive state is oftentimes what we don't think about, but it's that opportunity to talk with someone, to think about, hey, well, here's what it meant for me. And it's the fullest level of consciousness that you could have when watching or consuming some form of media. So these are the exposure states, which are also discussed in the chapter. It helps us to analyze the information that we've consumed. And the learning objectives for today, again, were to identify information processing tasks. And we also looked at analyzing the idea of exposure to our media messages as we move forward and consume so much media that is out there. So I will leave you again with Eli Pariser and his idea of the online filter bubbles. He calls for us to be aware of them, but there's also opportunity within the digital spaces we are in, because most would argue that we're only seeing content that is most relevant to us, but the online ethicist would say or would ask, is relevant really what matters? Shouldn't we be exposing ourselves to other things and allowing this digital filtration to better serve us? Thank you for watching.